June 1944. The hedgerow country of Normandy, France. A thick morning fog clung to the ancient bocage, those tangled walls of earth and root that had divided Norman farms for 1,000 years. Somewhere in this labyrinth of green corridors and sunken lanes, a young American private named Thomas Whitfield crouched behind a stone wall, clutching an object that would soon become the most unlikely weapon of his war. It was not a rifle. It was not a grenade. It was an old aluminum canteen, dented and scratched, still bearing the faded initials of someone who had carried it before him. Within 48 hours, that canteen and dozens like it would consume more than 5,000 rounds of ammunition from the opposing forces, rounds that would harm no one, protect countless lives, and demonstrate that sometimes the most effective tools in any conflict are not weapons at all, but ideas. The German defenders stationed along the hedgerow lines were absolutely certain they understood American tactics. They had studied the patterns, noted the predictable movements, and prepared their positions accordingly. They believed that when an American soldier moved, he moved with noise and haste, a reflection of what they perceived as undisciplined enthusiasm. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption could be. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over those 2 remarkable days in the Norman countryside would transform a simple piece of field equipment into a legend, save an untold number of lives on both sides, and reveal a truth about human ingenuity that transcends any single moment in history. This is the story of how American soldiers turned their canteens into silent decoys, exploiting psychology and physics to shift the balance of an entire sector, one glinting piece of aluminum at a time. The hedgerow country of Normandy presented a tactical nightmare unlike anything the Allied forces had trained for. Back in England, during the months of preparation, the focus had been on the beach landings, on the cliffs and fortifications that lined the coastline. What lay beyond those beaches received far less attention. The bocage, as the locals called it, consisted of fields divided by earthen mounds topped with dense vegetation, some of these natural barriers standing over 2 meters tall and stretching back centuries. Each field became a potential fortress. Each hedgerow concealed potential danger. Movement between these enclosed spaces meant exposure, and exposure in the bocage often meant catastrophe. Sergeant William Reeves of the 29th Infantry Division had been in the hedgerow country for 11 days when the canteen trick first emerged as a coordinated tactic. A career soldier from Virginia who had served in the peacetime army before the global conflict began, Reeves had the kind of practical intelligence that formal military education could never fully replicate. He noticed things, he remembered patterns, and he had been watching how the opposing forces responded to movement with increasing frustration. The German defenders, Reeves observed, had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect American movement. Their positions were expertly chosen, their fields of observation carefully planned. Whenever an American soldier attempted to cross from one hedgerow to another, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The defenders would unleash concentrated volleys, creating zones of impossibility that pinned down entire units for hours. Casualties mounted, progress slowed to a crawl. The liberation of France, which had begun with such momentum on the beaches, threatened to stagnate in these ancient farming fields. It was Private First Class Raymond Chen who first articulated what would become the canteen solution. Chen, a 22-year-old from San Francisco, whose family had immigrated from China 2 generations earlier, had an engineering mind trapped in an infantryman's body. Before the conflict, he had studied mechanical engineering at the University of California, and he approached every problem with a methodical curiosity that his fellow soldiers found both amusing and invaluable. The insight came during a particularly frustrating afternoon when Chen's squad had been pinned down for over 3 hours. Lying in a drainage ditch, listening to rounds snap through the air above his position, Chen had been staring at his canteen. The aluminum surface caught the afternoon sunlight and threw a brief flash across the hedgerow opposite their position. The response from the German defenders was immediate. A burst of fire raked the hedgerow where the flash had appeared, shredding leaves and sending bark fragments spinning through the air. Chen's mind began working. The defenders were responding to visual stimuli, to the flash of light that suggested metal, that suggested a weapon, that suggested a target. They were not actually seeing soldiers. They were seeing indicators of soldiers and responding with overwhelming force. What if those indicators could be manufactured? What if the appearance of a target could be created without any actual target being present? That evening, Chen shared his observation with Sergeant Reeves. The two men sat in a foxhole as darkness settled over the bocage, speaking in low voices while Chen outlined his thinking. Reeves listened without interrupting, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Chen finished, Reeves remained silent for a long moment. Then, said Reeves slowly, "What you are telling me is that if we can make them think they see us, they will shoot at nothing." Chen nodded. "They are responding to the flash, Sergeant. The reflection. If we can create that reflection without exposing anyone, they waste their ammunition on empty air." Reeves considered this. The German forces in this sector were well supplied, but not infinitely so. Every round they expended on phantom targets was a round they could not use on real ones. Every magazine emptied at a decoy was a magazine that would need replacement. And replacement in the tangled supply lines of the hedgerow country was not always guaranteed. The first test came the following morning. Chen had prepared 3 canteens, each attached to a length of cord. The plan was simple in concept, but required careful implementation. Chen would remain in cover while extending a canteen on the end of a stick, positioning it just above the hedgerow line where it would catch the morning sun. The flash would draw fire. American observers would note the German positions based on the muzzle flashes of their response, and not a single American soldier would be exposed. Private Thomas Whitfield volunteered to operate the first decoy. At 20 years old, Whitfield was one of the youngest men in the squad, a farm boy from Iowa who had never traveled more than 50 miles from home before the conflict began. He had proven himself steady under pressure, with a calmness that older soldiers envied. Now he lay in a shallow depression, canteen tied to a broken branch, waiting for the signal from Sergeant Reeves. The signal came. A single raised fist, then a downward motion. Whitfield pushed the branch upward, angling the canteen to catch the light. The aluminum flashed once, twice, 3 times as Whitfield manipulated his improvised apparatus. The response was exactly as Chen had predicted. A concentrated burst of fire erupted from 3 separate positions along the opposing hedgerow. Rounds tore through the vegetation above Whitfield's position, but he was well below the line of fire, completely protected by the earthen mound. The canteen, mounted on its stick, took several direct impacts, spinning wildly before Whitfield pulled it back down. Lieutenant James Morrison, the platoon commander, had been observing from a flanking position with field glasses. He had marked the locations of all 3 German firing positions with precision. Information that, under normal circumstances, would have cost American casualties to obtain had been gathered without a single soldier being exposed. The triumph of that first test spread through the company within hours. By afternoon, soldiers throughout the sector were experimenting with their own variations. Some used canteen cups instead of full canteens. Others discovered that mess kit lids produced an even more dramatic flash. A particularly creative corporal named Davis fashioned a system using multiple reflective objects on a single apparatus, creating the impression of an entire fire team moving along a hedgerow. Word of the tactic reached Captain Harold Bennett, the company commander, by evening. Bennett was a West Point graduate, year of 1939, who had learned the hard way that battlefield innovation often came from the enlisted ranks rather than the officer corps. He immediately recognized the potential of what his men had discovered and requested a meeting with Chen, Reeves, and several other soldiers who had been refining the technique throughout the day. The meeting took place in a bombed-out farmhouse that served as the company command post. Bennett listened as Chen explained the principles behind the tactic, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own engineering background. When Chen finished, Bennett turned to Reeves. "Sergeant, how many rounds do you estimate we drew today using this method?" asked Bennett. Reeves had been keeping a rough count. "Over 800, sir," he replied, "from our sector alone, and I've heard similar reports from 2nd and 3rd platoons." Bennett nodded slowly. 800 rounds, no casualties on our side, precise location data on multiple defensive positions. Gentlemen, he said, I believe we have stumbled onto something significant. What followed was an organized campaign of deception that would last 48 hours and consume resources at a rate that German commanders found inexplicable. Bennett coordinated with adjacent units, sharing the technique and encouraging its adoption across the entire regimental front. He established teams specifically dedicated to decoy operations, freeing other soldiers to prepare for actual movements that would exploit the intelligence gathered. The German defenders, for their part, found themselves in an increasingly frustrating situation. Their doctrine emphasized immediate and overwhelming response to any detected movement. This doctrine had served them well in the early days of the hedgerow fighting, when American forces were still learning the brutal mathematics of bocage warfare. But now that doctrine was being turned against them. Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann commanded a machine gun position that anchored the center of the German line in this sector. A veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, Hartmann had experience that few soldiers on either side could match. He had survived 4 years of conflict through a combination of capability, caution, and an almost preternatural ability to read the battlefield. But in those June days in Normandy, Hartmann found himself confronting something he had never encountered before. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere. Every flash of light drew fire from his position and others along the line. His gunners were exhausting ammunition at an alarming rate. Yet when patrols ventured forward to confirm their results, they found nothing. No bodies, no abandoned equipment, only churned earth and shredded vegetation. Hartmann reported his concerns to his company commander, Hauptmann Werner Schultz. The Americans are doing something, Hartmann insisted. They are not exposing themselves the way they did before. We are shooting at shadows. Schultz, a younger officer who had earned his commission through the accelerated programs that the German military had implemented as the conflict expanded, dismissed Hartmann's concerns. You are suggesting that the Americans have suddenly become clever, Schultz replied with barely concealed condescension. They are simply becoming more cautious. Maintain your fire discipline and continue engaging targets as they appear. But Hartmann knew what he was seeing, or rather, what he was not seeing. The flash of light that should indicate a moving soldier was appearing in locations where no rational soldier would position himself. The patterns were wrong. The timing was wrong. Something fundamental had changed, and Hartmann could not identify what it was. The breakthrough came on the morning of the second day. An American soldier, in his enthusiasm to improve the decoy technique, had attached a captured German helmet to his apparatus alongside the canteen. The combination created an extraordinarily convincing silhouette when raised above the hedgerow line. German defenders responded with their heaviest concentrated fire of the entire operation. Hartmann watched through his field glasses as the supposed American position absorbed dozens of rounds without any indication of casualties. No screams, no secondary movement, no attempt at withdrawal. Just the continued presence of that helmet and that flash of light, absorbing punishment that should have incapacitated an entire squad. Then understanding struck Hartmann with the force of physical impact. The Americans were not there. They had never been there. The flashes, the silhouettes, the apparent targets that had drawn thousands of rounds over the past day and a half were nothing more than decoys. Simple, brilliant decoys that exploited the German doctrine of immediate, overwhelming response. Hartmann scrambled to his company command post, ignoring the danger of movement in daylight, driven by the urgency of his realization. He burst into Hauptmann Schultz's presence with a complete violation of military protocol, but the younger officer's protest faded on his lips when he saw Hartmann's expression. Herr Hauptmann, Hartmann gasped. They are using decoys, reflective objects on sticks. We have been shooting at canteens and mess kits for 2 days. We have wasted thousands of rounds on nothing. Schultz stared at his senior sergeant. The implications were immediately clear. Ammunition that had been expended could not be replaced quickly. The supply situation in Normandy was already strained by Allied air superiority, which made daylight movement of supplies extremely dangerous. Every round fired at a decoy was a round that would not be available when the Americans launched their actual advance, and that advance came that very afternoon, The American operation, when it finally materialized, was carried out with precision that the German defenders had not witnessed before. Lieutenant Morrison led his platoon through a gap in the hedgerow line that German machine guns should have covered. But those guns were being reloaded, their crews frantically working to prepare for an advance that was already upon them. Private Whitfield moved with his squad through terrain that should have been impassable. He carried his dented canteen on his belt, its aluminum surface scarred by the rounds it had absorbed during its service as a decoy. Later, he would tell his children and grandchildren about that canteen, about how a simple piece of field equipment had saved more lives than any weapon he ever carried. The German defensive line in that sector collapsed within 2 hours, not because the defenders lacked courage or ability, but because they lacked ammunition. The psychological warfare conducted by Chen, Reeves, Whitfield, and dozens of other American soldiers had achieved through deception what direct confrontation might never have accomplished. Feldwebel Hartmann was among those captured during the American advance. As he was led to the rear by American military police, he passed a group of soldiers who were comparing their decoy apparatuses, laughing and joking about whose canteen had drawn the most fire. Hartmann stopped, staring at the collection of battered aluminum objects that had contributed to his unit's defeat. One of the American soldiers noticed Hartmann's attention. The sergeant, whose name tag read Chen, approached the German prisoner. Hartmann expected mockery, perhaps some form of gloating over the German defeat. Instead, Chen simply held up his own canteen, its surface pockmarked with dents from near misses. "Engineering problem," Chen said in heavily accented German. "You respond to stimulus. We create false stimulus. Simple physics." Hartmann nodded slowly. He had been outthought, not outfought. There was a strange comfort in that understanding. The canteen decoy tactic spread throughout the American forces in Normandy during the weeks that followed. Formal training programs were developed. Specialized decoy equipment was designed and manufactured. What had begun as the observation of a single private from San Francisco became standard doctrine, taught in training camps and employed across multiple theaters of operation. The official after-action reports from that sector estimated that over 5,000 rounds of ammunition had been expended by German forces against decoy targets during the 48-hour operation. The actual number was likely higher, as not all engagements were formally recorded. What was recorded with certainty was that American casualties during the operation were a fraction of what they had been in previous hedgerow engagements. Captain Bennett received a commendation for his role in developing and disseminating the tactic. Sergeant Reeves was promoted and transferred to a training unit, where he taught the technique to fresh replacements. Private First Class Chen received the Bronze Star and was reassigned to a tactical development unit that spent the remainder of the conflict devising similar solutions to battlefield challenges. Private Thomas Whitfield carried his original decoy canteen through the remainder of the European campaign. He refused all offers to replace it, even when supply sergeants pointed out that the numerous dents and holes made it nearly useless for its intended purpose of carrying water. That canteen, Whitfield would explain, had saved his life and the lives of his friends. It had earned its place on his belt. The story of the canteen decoys became one of countless innovations that emerged from the hedgerow fighting in Normandy. American soldiers, facing a tactical environment for which they had not been adequately prepared, adapted with creativity and determination that transformed apparent disadvantage into unexpected advantage. They learned to work with the hedgerows rather than simply against them. They developed new tactics for armored vehicles, for infantry coordination, for the countless challenges that the bocage presented. What made the canteen decoy particularly significant was its simplicity. It required no special equipment, no additional training, no resources beyond what every soldier already carried. It was pure applied psychology, the recognition that the enemy would respond to certain stimuli in predictable ways, and that those responses could be manipulated to American advantage. Decades after the conflict ended, Raymond Chen returned to Normandy as part of a veterans' commemoration. He walked the hedgerow country with his granddaughter, showing her the fields where he had lain in drainage ditches, the stone walls behind which he had crouched, the exact spot where he had first observed the flash of his canteen and conceived the idea that would save so many lives. His granddaughter asked him why the tactic had worked so well. Chen, now in his 80s but still in full command of the methodical mind that had served him throughout his life, considered the question carefully before answering. People respond to what they expect to see, Chen explained. The German soldiers expected to see American soldiers moving across those fields. When they saw something that looked like what they expected, they responded the way they had been trained to respond. They never stopped to ask whether what they were seeing was real. They just reacted. He paused, looking out over the peaceful Norman landscape, so different now from the torn and smoking terrain of his memory. We did not defeat them with superior weapons or superior numbers, Chen continued. We defeated them by understanding how they thought and giving them what they expected to see. The canteen was just a tool. The real weapon was the idea. Thomas Whitfield kept his decoy canteen until his final days in 2003. His family donated it to a military museum in Iowa, where it remains on display alongside other artifacts from the Hedgerow campaign. The placard beneath it tells a simplified version of the story, mentioning the tactical innovation but not fully capturing the human ingenuity and desperate creativity that gave it birth. But those who served in those Norman fields remember. They remember the long hours of being pinned down, the frustration of facing an enemy who seemed to see every movement, the gradual realization that something could be done, that even ordinary soldiers with ordinary equipment could find solutions to extraordinary problems. They remember Raymond Chen, the engineering student who became a tactical innovator. They remember William Reeves, the career sergeant who recognized potential in an unconventional idea. They remember Harold Bennett, the West Point officer who had the wisdom to listen to his enlisted men. And they remember the countless privates and corporals and specialists who refined and improved and spread the technique across the Hedgerow front. Most of all, they remember the lesson that the Canteen Decoys taught, that in any conflict, the most powerful resource is not firepower or numbers or technology, but human creativity, the ability to see a problem from a new angle, the willingness to try something that has never been tried before, the recognition that sometimes the most effective solution is also the simplest one. The hedgerows of Normandy have long since returned to their peaceful agricultural purpose. The stone walls and earthen mounds that witnessed such desperate innovation now shelter grazing cattle and growing crops. Tourists walk the lanes where soldiers once crept, taking photographs of scenery that reveals nothing of the drama it once contained. But in museums and veterans' halls, in family stories passed down through generations, the memory of the Canteen Decoys endures. It stands as a testament to the ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It reminds us that solutions can come from unexpected sources, that victory is not always achieved through overwhelming force, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is nothing more than a flash of sunlight on a piece of aluminum. The 5,000 rounds that German forces expended against those decoys represented more than just wasted ammunition. They represented a shift in the nature of the conflict in that sector, a psychological victory that preceded and enabled the physical one. They represented the triumph of thought over reaction, of innovation over doctrine, of the creative human spirit over the mechanical application of military force. And at the center of it all was something as ordinary as a soldier's canteen. Dented, scratched, filled with nothing more than air and imagination, it became a symbol of everything that human ingenuity can accomplish when necessity demands and courage allows. The story of the Canteen Decoys is not one of great generals or decisive conferences. It is a story of privates and sergeants, of young men far from home who found within themselves the creativity to change their circumstances. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as a tactical footnote in military history, but as a reminder of what ordinary people can achieve when they refuse to accept that a problem has no solution. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest lesson the hedgerow fighting taught, that the human capacity for innovation is inexhaustible, that even in the darkest circumstances, there remains the possibility of seeing the world differently, of finding the angle that no one else has noticed, of discovering that the tool you need has been hanging on your belt all along. The canteens have long since been replaced by more modern equipment. The soldiers who carried them have mostly moved from living memory into history. But their legacy endures in every problem solved through creative thinking, in every obstacle overcome through unexpected approaches, in every moment when someone looks at an ordinary object and sees extraordinary possibility. That is the true story of the Canteen Decoys of Normandy, not just a clever trick that saved ammunition and lives, but a demonstration of the enduring power of human creativity in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. It is a story that transcends its specific historical moment to speak to something universal about the human experience, our remarkable ability to adapt, to innovate, and to find hope even in the most hopeless situations. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.